What happens when a girl raised inside a temple to repent her demon blood discovers that the temple itself was the original sin? What happens when 15 years of forced apology don't cleanse a bloodline, they unlock it? And what happens when the people who taught a child to kneel finally meet the thing they were trying to bury? Dear viewer, this is the story of Lyra Vorenwell. And before I tell you how she walked out of that temple with 12 demonic emissaries waiting at the gates for her, you need to see what happened the moment the bells rang at dawn. Picture a stone temple, cold, dawn light bleeding through narrow windows. A girl in penance robes, white linen worn thin from years of wear, kneels on a marble floor so polished it reflects her face back at her. She has been kneeling since the third watch of the night. Her knees are bruised, her lips are chapped from whispering apologies to a god who, she has been told, would prefer she had never been born. The bells ring. 3 strikes. Dawn. And then her shadow, the shadow she has been forced to stare at every morning of her life, the shadow the priests told her was the visible mark of her demonic nature, the shadow she has been taught to fear. Her shadow detaches from the floor. It stands up beside her. The priests in the hall begin to scream. A bell falls from its mounting and shatters. The shadow places one long, dark hand on her shoulder, and in a voice older than the temple itself, older than the religion that built the temple, older than the kingdom that funded the religion, the shadow says 4 words. Daughter, the kneeling has ended. Lyra rises, her eyes split, one half black, one half gold. The temple roof peels back like burned paper, and outside the gates, 12 robed figures stand waiting, figures who have been searching for her for 15 years and have finally found her. She spent 15 years apologizing for what she was. The world spent 15 years owing her the apology back. Stay with me, dear viewer, because this story doesn't go where you think it does. Hit subscribe to Rise Arc, settle in, and let me tell you how a girl raised to repent became a queen who reshaped 2 realms before her 19th birthday. My name is Rise Arc. I am the one who walks through stories that history tried to bury and pulls them out into the light so you can see them whole. I was there in the records of the Temple of Pure Light. I was there in the journals the surviving priests tried to burn. I have read what the Hollow Cardinal wrote about Lyra Vorenwell in the year before he learned her name, and I will tell you all of it. Let me take you back. The Temple of Pure Light sits on a chalk cliff above the southern coast of the Kingdom of Aldenmere. It is white. Everything in it is white. The robes, the walls, the bread the penitents eat, the bed sheets in the dormitories, the candles in the chapel. Even the wine served at communion is a pale gold so soft it looks white in dim light. The temple was built 300 years ago on the principle that purity is the only protection against what they called the Whisperline, the demonic bloodline that, according to their doctrine, had infiltrated the human kingdoms during the Long War. For 3 centuries, the Temple of Pure Light had a specific function. When a child was born in Aldenmere with traits that the priests judged demonic, black and gold eyes, a shadow that moved a half-second out of sync with the body, an aversion to consecrated water, that child was brought to the temple. The priests called this the rescue. The parents called it the mercy. The children, when they were old enough to understand, called it nothing, because they were not permitted to speak unless spoken to. Lyra Vorenwell arrived at the temple at the age of 3. Her father, Heir Vorenwell, was a minor lord of the Eastern Marches. Her mother, whose name was deliberately scrubbed from the temple records, was rumored, though never confirmed, to have been a refugee from the Whisperline Court, the same demonic court the temple existed to protect against. When her mother died, Heir could not look at his daughter without seeing the woman he had loved and lost. He could not raise her. He told the priests he was offering her for purification. The priests accepted her. He paid them 400 gold sovereigns for 15 years of upkeep. He did not return. Lyra was raised in the dormitory the priests called the Garden of Apology. There were 37 other children there when she arrived. By the time she turned 18, she would be the only one left. The first thing the priests taught her, before they taught her to read, before they taught her to pray, was the posture of penance. Knees on the floor, hands clasped, head bowed, eyes on her own reflection in the polished stone. Whisper, on the count of 3 breaths, "I am sorry for the blood I carry." The blood she carried. She did not know what that meant. She was 3 years old. She knew she had a body. She knew the body had blood. She did not understand why the blood needed an apology. She learned to say it anyway. By age 5, she could say it in 3 liturgical languages. By age 7, she could say it while scrubbing the floor with her hands, so that her labor and her apology became a single continuous act. By age 9, and this, dear viewer, is the part of her story that will stay with you, she had begun to believe that her skin itself was the evidence of her sin. Here is the scene I want you to sit with. It is a scene that doesn't involve demon kings or magical awakenings or shadows that stand up on their own. It is the scene that, when I read it in the temple's own surviving records, made me stop reading for a full hour and stare at a wall. Lyra Vorenwell, age 9, in the washroom of the Garden of Apology before the sun had risen. The priests had told the children that their demonic nature could be seen in the skin, that it sat just beneath the surface like a stain, that if they scrubbed hard enough, with the rough yellow soap the temple distributed, the demon might begin to lift out. It was a lie. The priests knew it was a lie. They taught it because a child who is busy scrubbing herself bloody is a child who is not asking questions about why she is at the temple, or where her parents are, or why no one ever comes to visit. But Lyra didn't know it was a lie. So she did what the priests had told her to do. She took the yellow soap, she took the rough cloth, and she began to scrub her left forearm, then her right, then her shoulders, then her chest, then her stomach, then her thighs, then her left forearm again. Because the demon was still there, she could feel it. She scrubbed until her skin was raw. She scrubbed until it began to bleed in thin red lines. She scrubbed because the priests had said the demon would lift. The demon did not lift, so she scrubbed harder. The door of the washroom opened. A girl walked in. The girl's name was Lyra Holloway. She was 12 years old. She was not one of the penitents. She was a kitchen girl, the daughter of a temple servant named Old Jen Holloway, who had worked in the kitchens for 40 years. Lyra had grown up in the temple, alongside the penitents but separate from them, the way the daughter of a household servant grows up alongside the children of the family, but never inside the family. She wore a brown tunic instead of white. She ate a different bread. She slept in a cot off the kitchen instead of in the dormitory. She was not required to apologize for anything. Lyra stopped at the door of the washroom. She saw the 9-year-old girl with the bloody forearms. She saw the yellow soap. She understood immediately what had happened, because she had seen it happen before. She had seen what the priest's teachings did to children. She did not say anything. She did not ask Lyra what she was doing. She did not lecture her. She did not run for an adult. She walked across the washroom, took the yellow soap out of Lyra's hand, and put it on a high shelf where Lyra could not reach it. Then she took a clean cloth, ran it under cool water, knelt down beside Lyra, and began, very gently, to clean the wounds on Lyra's arms. She didn't scold. She didn't ask why. She just stayed. Dear viewer, this is the moment in the story that I think about most. Because here is the truth about people who survive things, about anyone who has ever been told, by anyone with authority over them, that there is something fundamentally wrong with them, that they need to be corrected, that they need to apologize for being who they are. The thing that saves them is almost never a hero. It's almost never a sword. It's almost never a magical awakening or a revealed bloodline. It's a person who walks into the washroom while they're bleeding, takes the soap away, and stays without asking why. You have had this person in your life, or you have been this person for someone else. Or you needed this person and they didn't come, and you are still carrying the absence of them. This is the scene that makes the rest of Lyra's story possible. Not the magic, not the bloodline. Lyra Holloway, 12 years old, with a wet cloth and no questions. When Lyra was 9, Lyra saved her without ever using that word. They never spoke about it again. The friendship that grew between them after that morning was a friendship made of silences and small kindnesses. Lyra would slip extra bread into Lyra's pocket during chapel. Lyra would leave wildflowers on the windowsill above Lyra's cot. Neither of them ever named what they were to each other. They didn't have to. Lyra is going to matter later in this story. Remember her name, Lyra Holloway, the kitchen girl who didn't ask. Now, back to the temple. The years between 9 and 18 passed for Lyra, the way years pass for any child raised under a doctrine that requires her to apologize for existing. She got taller. She learned to read scripture in 3 languages. She memorized the 72 forms of contrition. She passed the test of the silent week, in which a penitent must not speak for 7 days. She passed the test of the broken bread, in which a penitent must fast for 9 days and then refuse food when it is offered on the 10th. She passed every test the temple gave her. The 37 other children in the Garden of Apology did not. Some were sent away to other temples. Some were sent home to families that didn't want them. Some, and this was the rumor the kitchen staff whispered, never the priests, some were taken to a chamber beneath the temple for a ritual called the final purification and were never seen again. By the time Lyra turned 17, she was the only penitent left in the Garden of Apology. She slept alone in the dormitory designed for 40. She ate alone in the refectory. She prayed alone in the chapel. The priests called her the last daughter, and they said it as though it were an honor. Lyra understood, in the part of her mind she did not let herself examine, that it was not an honor. It was a queue, and the queue had moved forward until only she remained at the front of it. The final purification was scheduled for her 18th name day. 3 months before the date, a new priest arrived at the temple. His name was Father Aldemar Craythorne. He was tall, gray at the temples, with the kind of face that looked carved rather than born. He had served at 3 other temples before this one. He had presided over the final purification of more than 100 girls. The temple's high priesthood had brought him specifically for Lyra, because Lyra's case was, in their words, exceptional. She had not broken. Every other last daughter by their 18th name day had begun to show signs: sleeplessness, hallucinations, fits of rage. Lyra showed nothing. She knelt. She apologized. She passed every test. The priests were unnerved by her, and Father Aldemar had been brought to evaluate her. He met with her in the small chamber off the main chapel. He sat across from her on a wooden stool. He asked her one question. "Lyra, do you believe that you carry demon blood?" Lyra answered, "I have been told that I do, Father." He waited. He noted that she had not said yes. He had been hearing penitents answer this question for 30 years, and he knew the difference between a yes and a description of being told. He smiled, very faintly, the way a man smiles when he has just confirmed a suspicion he had been hoping was wrong. He said, "We will perform your final purification on the morning of your 18th name day. You will be ready." She bowed her head. She said, "Yes, Father." He left the chamber. He went directly to the high priesthood and told them that Lyra Vorenwell was the most dangerous penitent the Temple of Pure Light had ever housed, and that the final purification needed to be performed not just with the standard liturgy, but with the older liturgy, the one written in the founding charter of the temple 300 years ago, the one that had not been used since the temple's first decade, because it was, by their own admission, a ritual of binding rather than purification. They had been telling the children for 300 years that the final purification erased the demon. The truth, written in the founding charter that only the high priesthood had read, was that the final purification bound the demon, permanently, by killing the host body and dispersing the soul into ritual stone. It was not purification. It was containment. It was murder. Father Aldemar Craythorne did not tell Lyra any of this. He told her instead that the final purification would be peaceful, that she would feel a great lightness, that when it was over, she would be free of the burden she had carried since birth. She thanked him. She returned to the dormitory. She lay on her cot in the empty hall of 40 beds, and for the first time in 15 years, she allowed herself to think a thought she had never permitted before. She thought, "I do not want to die." It was a small thought. It was a thought that any 9-year-old should have been allowed to think freely. For Lyra, at the age of 17, it was the first crack in the cathedral the priests had built inside her skull. The next morning she went to the kitchen. She found Mira Halloway kneading bread, her sleeves rolled up to her elbows, flour on her cheek. Mira was 20 now, taller than Lyra, with strong arms from 12 years of kitchen work. She looked up when Lyra came in. She saw Lyra's face. She put down the dough. Lyra said, "Mira, I am going to die in 3 months." Mira said nothing for a long moment. Then she said, "I know." Lyra had not expected that answer. She stared at her friend. She said, "How long have you known?" Mira said, "My mother told me when I was 14. She said the final purification is not what they say it is. She said the girls don't come back because there is no coming back. She said I was not to tell you because they would punish me if they found out I knew, and they would punish you for knowing. But I have been waiting for you to ask, Lyra. I have been waiting 8 years. Lyra sat down on the kitchen floor. Mira sat down beside her. They did not embrace. They did not weep. They sat shoulder to shoulder on the warm stones near the bread oven, and Mira said, "There is a way out. My mother knows a man. He comes to the temple every spring to deliver salt. He is not a priest. He is from the south. He has asked about you before." Lyra said, "Who is he?" Mira said, "His name is Aaron Vexharrow. He says he has been looking for you since you were 3 years old." Now, dear viewer, you need to understand who Aaron Vexharrow was, because he is the second hinge on which Lyra's story turns. Aaron was a salt trader in his public life. In his private life, he was a sworn agent of the Whisperline Court, the very demonic court the Temple of Pure Light had been built to defend against. The Whisperline Court was not what the priests of Aldenmere had told the kingdom it was. It was not a band of marauders. It was not a horde of monsters. It was a court, a real political court, that had existed in the southern lands for over 1,000 years, with its own laws, its own scholars, its own libraries, and its own royal line. The royal line had been broken 300 years ago in a war that the priests of Pure Light had won by ambushing the Queen's traveling party and slaughtering everyone in it. Everyone, that is, except one child. A daughter, smuggled out by a maidservant and given a new name and a new life among the northern human nobility. That child had grown into a woman. That woman had married a minor lord of the Eastern Marches named Lyra Vorenwell. That woman had borne a single daughter before she died, a daughter the priests of Pure Light had identified within hours of her birth as the last living heir of the Whisperline royal line. The Temple of Pure Light had not taken Lyra in to save her. They had taken her in to finish a war that was 300 years old. Aaron Vexharrow had spent 15 years working his way close enough to that temple to confirm what the Whisperline Court suspected. He had been delivering salt and patience. He had spoken to old Jen Halloway in the kitchens. He had learned the rhythms of the temple. He had been waiting, like Mira, for the moment when Lyra would be ready. Mira told her all of this on the kitchen floor that morning. She told it plainly, without dressing it up. When she was done, Lyra sat in silence for a long time. Then she said, "Why did my father give me to them?" Mira said, "I don't know, Lyra. Maybe he didn't know what they would do. Maybe he did. Aaron can tell you more." Lyra said, "When does he come?" Mira said, 3 days. The spring salt delivery is in 3 days. 3 days later, Aaron Vexharrow arrived at the temple gate with 2 carts of salt. He was a thick-shouldered man in his 50s, with deeply tanned skin and a gray beard. He wore the dusty leathers of a southern trader. The priests did not look at him twice. Old Jen Halloway, working in the kitchen, sent Mira to fetch a barrel of salted fish from the cart. Mira went. She returned with the barrel and a small, folded square of waxed paper that she pressed into Lyra's hand under the table. The paper, when Lyra unfolded it in the privacy of her dormitory, contained 6 lines of writing in a careful hand. "Lyra, I served your mother. She named you Lyra of the Veiled Hour. The priests do not know your true name. The ritual they will perform will fail because of it. When the circle breaks, walk south. 12 will be at the gate. You will know them by their eyes. AAV." Lyra read it 3 times. She burned it in the candle flame. She lay on her cot. She did not sleep. The final purification was scheduled for the morning of her 18th nameday, 3 months from that day. In those 3 months, Lyra learned to lie. She had never lied before. She had been raised in a system where lying was the gravest sin a penitent could commit, and where the priests claimed to be able to detect lies by reading the soul. She had believed them. She had believed them for 15 years. Now she learned, very quickly, that the priests could not read the soul at all. They could only read the face. And the face, she discovered, could be trained. She knelt every morning. She apologized for her blood. She passed her tests. She thanked Father Aldemar Craythorne for his kindness. She wept at the appropriate moments during chapel. She did all of this while, underneath, she was preparing, memorizing the layout of the temple, the schedule of the guards, the rotation of the priests, the location of the southern gate, the count of paces from the ritual chamber to the gate. She did all of this while twice a week slipping notes to Aaron Vexharrow through old Jen Halloway's grain barrels. She learned, in those 3 months, that there were others inside the temple who had been waiting for her too. There was Sister Velka Threnholm, the librarian, a tall, severe woman in her 60s who had served the temple for 40 years and who, 2 months before the ritual, walked into Lyra's dormitory in the middle of the night and placed a small leather-bound book on her pillow without saying a word. The book, when Lyra opened it, contained the founding charter of the Temple of Pure Light, the full charter, including the part the high priesthood had never shown the lower priests, including the part that described in plain language that the final purification was a murder ritual. Sister Velka had stolen the book from the High Archive. She had risked her life to bring it. When Lyra looked up, Sister Velka had already left the dormitory. She had not stayed for thanks. There was Brother Canis Oro, the young priest in charge of the chapel. He was 26. He had been raised in a different temple of pure light, the one in the Western Mountains, and had transferred to this one 2 years before Lyra's 18th nameday because he had been promised a position close to the high priesthood. He had been at the temple for 1 full year before he understood what the final purification actually was. He had spent the 2nd year deciding what to do about it. 3 weeks before the ritual, he intercepted Lyra in the chapel hallway and pressed a small iron key into her palm. He whispered, "This opens the side door of the ritual chamber, the one behind the altar. When the circle breaks, do not run for the main door. The main door will be guarded. Run for the side door. I will be there." Lyra said, "Why are you helping me?" Brother Canis said, "Because I took vows. And the vows I took were not the vows they are using me to enforce. I will see you at the side door, Lyra. Be ready." And there was, finally, the most important defection, the one Lyra did not see coming. 3 days before the ritual, Father Aldemar Craythorne came to her chamber alone. He sat on the wooden stool. He looked at her for a long time. Then he said, "Child, do you know what is about to happen to you?" Lyra, who had spent 3 months perfecting her face, said only, "I will be purified, Father." Father Aldemar closed his eyes. He said, "Lyra, I have presided over the final purification of 104 girls. I have known for the last 40 of them what the ritual actually does. I performed it anyway because I told myself that I was a servant of a higher order, and that the higher order had reasons I was not meant to understand. I told myself this for 20 years. And then last spring I sat across from a girl named Threnna who was 16 years old, and she looked at me the way you are looking at me now, and I performed the ritual, and she died on the stone of the ritual chamber, and I went back to my room and I could not pray. I have not been able to pray since." He opened his eyes. He said, "Lyra, I am going to perform the ritual on your 18th nameday because the high priesthood will execute me if I refuse. But I am going to perform it incorrectly. I am going to invert one of the binding sigils. The circle will break. When it does, you will have approximately 90 seconds before the high priesthood understands what has happened. I am telling you this because I have lived with 104 deaths, and I will not live with 105th. Do not thank me. I do not deserve thanks. Just live." He stood up. He walked out of the chamber. Lyra did not thank him. She did, however, sit very still for a long time after he left, because she understood that the temple was not, as she had been told her entire life, a single united body of pure servants of a pure God. It was a building full of frightened people, some of whom had decided, separately, in the secret rooms of their own consciences, to commit treason against an institution that had asked them to commit murder. Father Aldemar Craythorne, Sister Velka Threnholm, Brother Canis Oro, Old Jen Halloway, Mira Halloway, Aaron Vexharrow. 6 people, none of whom knew about each other's plans, all of them ready to risk their lives for a girl who had been told for 15 years that she did not deserve to live. This, dear viewer, is what I want you to take from this part of the story. Systems of cruelty look monolithic from the outside. They look like one wall. But every system of cruelty is staffed, in the end, by individual human beings. And in any sufficiently long-running system, a number of those human beings will, in the privacy of their own minds, decide that they cannot keep doing what the system is asking them to do. They will look for the moment to defect. Most of them will never find it. Some of them will find it and lose their nerve. A few, a very few, will find the moment and will act and will risk everything. Lyra Vorenwell, on the morning of her 18th name day, walked to the ritual chamber surrounded by guards, with 6 different conspirators waiting to break 6 different parts of the system at once, and not one of them had coordinated with the others. This is the part where the temple falls. The ritual chamber lay beneath the chapel, 3 levels down a spiral stair carved into the chalk of the cliff. The walls were white stone shot through with veins of dark iron. The floor was a single slab of polished obsidian, into which had been carved the binding sigils of the founding charter, a circle within a triangle, each angle marked with a glyph in the old tongue. 12 braziers ringed the chamber. The high priesthood stood in a semicircle at the south end. Father Aldemar Craythorne stood at the center, robed in white, with a curved knife on a silver tray at his feet. Lyra was led in by 2 guards in white. She was barefoot. Her hair had been shaved that morning, as the liturgy required. She wore a simple white shift. She had been told that the ritual would be painless. She had been told that she would feel a great lightness. She had been told a great many things in 15 years. She stepped into the center of the obsidian circle. Father Aldemar lifted the curved knife. He began the liturgy in the old tongue, his voice steady, his face calm. The braziers flared. The sigils on the floor began to glow a deep red. The high priesthood watched, satisfied. Lyra waited. Father Aldemar reached the 72nd line of the liturgy, the line at which the binding sigil at the north angle of the triangle was to be activated by his blade drawn across his own palm and a single drop of his blood falling onto the glyph. He cut his palm. He held his hand over the glyph. He turned his hand a quarter turn, a small motion, almost invisible to the high priesthood watching from the south end. The drop of blood fell. It struck not the binding sigil, but the inverted glyph beside it, the one Father Aldemar had scratched into the obsidian with a nail over the course of the previous night. The chamber went silent. The braziers did not flare. They went out, all 12 at once. The sigils on the floor stopped glowing red. They began to glow gold. The high priesthood, who had observed this ritual 104 times, understood instantly that something was wrong. The chief high priest, a man named Magister Pel Terrawind, opened his mouth to shout an order. The order did not come out. Because the air in the ritual chamber, which was supposed to grow heavy with binding magic, had instead grown thin and cold, and the obsidian floor had begun to crack. Lyra felt it first as a warmth at the base of her spine. It was not pain. It was something she had never felt before. It was a presence, rising up through her body, settling into her bones, into her ribs, into her skull. It was the part of her that the temple had spent 15 years trying to scrape out of her with apologies and yellow soap. It had not gone anywhere. It had been waiting. Her eyes split, one half black, one half gold. Her shadow, which had been lying flat on the obsidian beneath her feet, began to rise. It rose slowly. It took the shape of a tall figure beside her, taller than Father Aldemar, taller than any priest in the room. It had no face, only 2 points of gold light where eyes should be. It placed one long, dark hand on Lyra's shoulder, and in a voice that was not Lyra's voice, and was not the shadow's voice, and was, somehow, both, it spoke. It said, "Daughter, the kneeling has ended." The chamber exploded outward. The obsidian floor shattered. The 12 braziers were flung against the walls. 3 of the priests in the semicircle were thrown off their feet. Magister Pel Terrawind was knocked unconscious against the stone wall. Father Aldemar Craythorne, who had been standing at the center, was thrown clear by the same force that protected Lyra, because the inverted sigil he had drawn had not just broken the binding, it had transferred the binding's protective field around him. He landed against the side wall. He was bleeding from a cut on his forehead. He was alive. Lyra stood at the center of the shattered circle. Her shadow stood beside her. The gold sigils on the floor pulsed once, twice, and went dark. Above them, 3 levels up in the chapel, the bells began to ring. Not the dawn bells, not the bells for chapel, the alarm bells. The temple knew, in the way old institutions know things, that it had just lost a war it had been winning for 300 years. Brother Canis Oro was at the side door of the ritual chamber when Lyra reached it. He had the door open. He took her hand and pulled her through. They climbed the back stair together, 2 levels up, into a service corridor that the priests rarely used. Mira Halloway was waiting in the corridor. She had a brown traveling cloak in her hands. She threw it over Lyra's shoulders. She did not say anything, she just took Lyra's other hand. They moved through the temple together, Brother Canis leading, Mira and Lyra following. They passed Sister Velka Threnholm in the library hall. Sister Velka, who had positioned herself there specifically to misdirect any guards who came running. She nodded at them as they passed. They did not stop. They reached the southern gate of the temple at dawn. The gate was open. Old Jen Halloway was standing beside it with Aaron Vexharrow. And beyond the gate, on the road that led south, 12 figures stood in a half-circle. They wore dark traveling robes. They had pale faces. Their eyes, even at distance, glowed faintly gold in the dawn light. They had been standing on that road for 3 days, waiting. Some of them had been searching for Lyra for 15 years. One of them, a tall woman at the center of the half-circle, with silver hair braided into a long rope down her back, had served Lyra's mother as a girl. Her name was Calith Sworn of Dusk. She had been the maidservant who, 300 years ago, no, 18 years ago, but it felt like 300 years to her, had smuggled Lyra out of her cradle on the night her mother died. She had been waiting for this morning since that night. Lyra walked through the southern gate of the Temple of Pure Light. She walked toward the 12 figures on the road. Her shadow walked beside her, no longer a shadow but a presence, taller than her, gold-eyed, calm. Mira walked on her other side. Brother Canis walked behind her. Aaron Vexharrow and Old Jen brought up the rear. Calith Sworn of Dusk took 1 step forward. She knelt on the road. The other 11 figures knelt with her. Calith said in a voice steady from a lifetime of waiting, "My queen, the Whisperline Court has been waiting for you." Lyra stopped on the road. She looked at the 12 kneeling figures. She looked at her shadow. She looked back at the temple, where the alarm bells were still ringing, where Father Aldemar Craythorne was being dragged unconscious from the ritual chamber, where Magister Pel Terrawind was beginning to wake up and understand that he had just lost the largest political asset his temple had ever held. She looked at Mira. Mira nodded. Lyra said to the 12 kneeling figures the first words she had ever spoken as a queen. "Rise. We have a great deal of work to do." The journey south took 11 days. They traveled by night when they could, by day when they had to. Aaron Vexharrow knew the back roads. Calith Sworn of Dusk knew the safe houses. The other 11 emissaries, whose names I will give you because they will matter in the next chapter of this story, were Vesha Merowyn the Scholar, Tarn Velgrave the Swordsman, Dressa Lore, who had once been a captain in the Aldenmere Royal Guard before she defected, and 8 others who served the Whisperline Court in various capacities, from spycraft to healing to the management of the court's library, which had been hidden in a sea cave south of the kingdom for 290 years. On the second night of the journey, Calith Sworn of Dusk sat across from Lyra at a small campfire and told her, in plain words, who her mother had been. Her mother's name was Sarah of the Veiled Hour. She had been the youngest daughter of the last queen of the Whisperline Court. She had been 3 years old on the night the priests of Pure Light ambushed her mother's traveling party and slaughtered everyone in it. Calith, then 16, had hidden Sarah in a salt barrel and walked her north for 6 weeks, sleeping in ditches, begging food. When they reached the eastern marches of Aldenmere, Calith had placed Sarah in the household of a minor lord who owed the Whisperline Court a debt. The lord raised Sarah as his ward. Sarah grew up not knowing what she was. She married Lyra Vorenwell. She bore Lyra. She died of a fever the priests had almost certainly induced through poisoned wine. Calith had been watching from a distance for 15 years, waiting for the moment when Lyra would be old enough, and the temple desperate enough, to give Calith a window. Lyra listened to all of this in silence. When Calith was done, Lyra said, "My father." "Did he know what my mother was?" Calith said, "He knew. He did not understand the full meaning of it. He understood enough to be afraid. When your mother died, his fear became larger than his love. He gave you to the temple because he believed the temple would purify you. He did not know that purification meant murder. He was a coward. He was not a monster." Lyra said, "Is he still alive?" Calith said, "Yes. He lives in the eastern marches still. He is not remarried. He has not had other children. He drinks heavily. He is 51 years old." Lyra said, "We will not visit him." Calith bowed her head. "As my queen commands." They reached the Whisperline Court on the 11th night. It was not, as the priests of pure light had told the kingdom for 300 years, a fortress of black stone full of demonic monsters. It was a small city carved into the chalk cliffs of the southern coast, with white buildings and gardens and libraries and a deep-water harbor. It had 11,000 citizens. It had laws. It had schools. It had been hiding in plain sight for 3 centuries, surviving on quiet trade and on the long patience of a people who knew they were waiting for the return of their queen. Lyra was crowned on the 14th night after her escape. She wore a circlet of dark iron set with a single gold stone. She did not wear white. She would never wear white again. The coronation was attended by every citizen of the Whisperline Court who could walk to the central plaza. They did not cheer. They did not weep. They stood in absolute silence as Calith placed the circlet on Lyra's head, and then, in unison, they bowed. Mira Halloway stood beside her. Brother Canis Oro stood at her other side. Aaron Vexharo stood behind her. The 12 emissaries stood in a ring around the 4 of them. The shadow that had risen from the obsidian floor in the temple ritual chamber stood at Lyra's right hand, where it would stand for the rest of her life. It had a name now. Its name was Vern, and it was, the scholars of the Whisperline Court explained, the manifested ancestral memory of the Whisperline royal line. Every queen had carried Vern. The line had been broken when Lyra's grandmother died. Vern had been waiting in the dark of the obsidian floor of the Temple of Pure Light for 300 years, because the obsidian for that floor had been quarried from the demolished walls of the old Whisperline Palace, and Varen had been embedded in the stone the entire time. The priests had been performing their murder ritual for 3 centuries on top of the very thing they were trying to destroy. Now, the work. Lyra Vorenwell, Queen of the Whisperline Court, was 18 years old. She had been raised in a temple that had taught her to apologize for existing. She had spent 15 years memorizing 72 forms of contrition. She had spent the last 3 months learning to lie. She had walked out of the temple with 6 conspirators, 12 emissaries, and an ancestral shadow. She had, in 11 days, become the sovereign of an entire hidden people. She had a kingdom to rebuild. She had a temple to dismantle. She had a father she would never visit. She had a friend, Mira Halloway, who was now the Lord Chamberlain of the Whisperline Court, because Lyra would not be separated from her. She had brother Canis Oro, who had been made the chief diplomat to the human kingdoms because he understood, better than any of the Whisperline scholars, how the priesthood of pure light actually thought. She had Father Aldemar Craythorne, who had survived the explosion of the ritual chamber and who, 3 months after Lyra's coronation, walked alone to the southern coast and asked to be admitted to the Whisperline Court, not as a refugee, but as a penitent. Lyra had received him. She had not forgiven him. She had given him a job, the cataloging of every final purification the Temple of Pure Light had performed in 300 years, with the names of every priest who had presided and the location of every body. Father Aldemar Craythorne accepted the work. He spent the next 9 years on it. He would die at his desk in the Whisperline archive with a quill in his hand and a list of 341 names beside him. Lyra would attend his funeral. She would not speak. She would place a single white stone on his grave, the stone she had picked up from the floor of the shattered ritual chamber on the morning of her escape. It was the only white thing she would ever willingly touch again. But all of that came later. In the first year of her reign, Lyra had a more immediate problem. The Temple of Pure Light did not accept its defeat quietly. The High Priesthood, led by Magister Pel Terrawind, regrouped within a month of the shattered ritual. They drafted a formal proclamation to the King of Aldenmere, declaring that a demonic incursion had occurred at the temple and that the southern lands had been infiltrated by an unholy court, requiring immediate military response. Magister Pel was a careful politician. He knew that the king, a weak-willed man named Halvard III, who had inherited the throne at the age of 19 and had not made an independent decision since, would do whatever the temple told him to do, provided the temple framed it correctly. What Magister Pel did not know was that the framing itself was being shaped by someone else. There was, in the king's court, a figure the records refer to only by his title, the Hollow Cardinal. His given name was Othric Vane. He was 62 years old, He had served 3 kings. He was, on paper, an advisor on ecclesiastical matters. In practice, he was the man who decided which proclamations reached the king's desk and which did not. He was the man who decided which advisors the king listened to and which were quietly transferred to distant postings. He was the man who had, for the last 30 years, shaped every major decision the kingdom of Aldenmere had made. And the Hollow Cardinal, dear viewer, was the one who had originally signed the order, 45 years ago, to perform the final purification of the second-to-last queen of the Whisperline Court. He had been a young priest then. He had drafted the order with his own hand. He had risen through the priesthood and into the royal court on the strength of that single act of zealotry. He had spent the rest of his life ensuring that no record of his authorship survived. When Magister Pell's proclamation reached the royal court, the Hollow Cardinal read it before the king did. He understood immediately what it meant. The Whisperline royal line had returned. The act that had built his entire career was about to be undone. If Lyra Vorenwell consolidated her court and made contact with the human kingdoms as a legitimate sovereign, the diplomatic chain would eventually surface his name. He would be exposed not as a wise old advisor, but as the architect of a 300-year murder. He did not show the proclamation to the king. He drafted a different proclamation in its place, one that declared, in stronger language than Magister Pell had used, that the southern coast was under demonic occupation and that a holy crusade was required to cleanse the land. He signed it with the king's seal, which he had access to because the king trusted him absolutely. He sent it to every major lord in Aldenmere. Within 6 weeks, an army of 11,000 men was being raised. The Hollow Cardinal then drafted a second document, a private one, which he sent by sealed courier to the Temple of Pure Light. The document instructed Magister Pell that the crusade was to be commanded jointly by the temple and by a man named Captain Dressa Lore, who had once been a captain in the Royal Guard before defecting to the Whisperline Court, and whom the Hollow Cardinal believed could still be turned. The Hollow Cardinal was wrong about Dressa Lore. She had not been turnable for 12 years, but the Hollow Cardinal did not know that. He still operated in the small private theater of his own mind, as though every piece on the board could be moved with enough pressure. The proclamation reached the Whisperline Court 6 weeks after it was signed. Lyra read it in her council chamber, surrounded by Mira Halloway, Brother Canis Oro, Calith Sworn of Dusk, Aaron Vexharrow, Vesha Merriwind, Tarn Velgrave, and Dressa Lore. She read it twice. She placed it on the table. She said, "Who drafted this?" Brother Canis, who had been trained in the rhetorical patterns of the priesthood for 26 years, said, "Not Magister Pell. This is older language. This is the language of the founding charter. There are only 3 living people who write this way. 2 of them are too old to hold a quill. The third is the Hollow Cardinal." Lyra said, "Tell me about the Hollow Cardinal." Brother Canis told her what he knew. He knew enough. He had been in the Western Temple where the Hollow Cardinal had given a sermon when Brother Canis was 18. He had seen the Hollow Cardinal's face. He had heard his voice. He had read 3 of his theological treatises. He could draw from memory the man's handwriting. Vesha Merriwind, the Whisperline Court's chief scholar, then added the piece Brother Canis did not have. She said, "We have a record of him in our archive. He drafted the order to murder your great-grandmother, my queen. We have the original. It is in the 3rd vault. He was 23 years old when he signed it. He has been the architect of every major action the Temple of Pure Light has taken against us since." Lyra said, "Do we have his signature?" Vesha said, "We have 9 of his signatures." Lyra said, "Cross-reference them with the proclamation." It took 3 days. The match was conclusive. The proclamation that was raising 11,000 men against the Whisperline Court had been signed not by King Halvard III, but by Cardinal Othric Vane, who had stolen the king's seal. Lyra sat in her council chamber after the match was confirmed. She did not speak for an hour. Mira sat beside her. No one else dared. When Lyra finally spoke, she said, "We will not fight the king. We will fight one man. We will go to the cathedral at Brenhall, where the cardinal holds his weekly council. We will not bring an army. We will bring me, Mira, Brother Canis, Calith, Dressa, and Vern. We will arrive on the morning of his next council. We will let him see us walk in. We will not raise a weapon. We will let him understand what has happened by the simple fact of our presence." Calith said, "My queen, he will have guards." Lyra said, "I have Vern." Brother Canis said, my queen. If we do this and we fail, the crusade will come anyway, and we will have given them a martyr." Lyra said, "If we do this and we succeed, the king will learn for the first time in 30 years that the man advising him is the architect of a 300-year war. He will not survive that knowledge intact. The crusade will collapse without its author. And the kingdom of Aldenmere will be open to negotiation with the Whisperline Court for the first time in its history." Mira said quietly, "And if you die in the cathedral, Lyra?" Lyra looked at her oldest friend. She said, "Then you will be queen, Mira. You have been my Lord Chamberlain for 10 months, and you have made better decisions than I have. The court will hold." Mira said, "I am not of the bloodline." Lyra said, "The bloodline ends with me one way or another. I have no children. I have no plans for children. The court will need a sovereign. You will do." Mira did not argue further. She had known Lyra for 11 years. She knew when an argument was finished. They left for Brennel 7 days later. The journey took 9 days. They traveled openly. The Hollow Cardinal's intelligence network, which was extensive, but which had been deliberately fed false leads by Aaron Vexharrow for the last 3 months, was watching the southern coast for an army. It was not watching the eastern road for a party of 6. They reached Brennel on the morning of the Cardinal's weekly council. They walked into the cathedral through the main doors. The 2 guards at the entrance recognized Dressa Lore. She had served with one of them for 4 years, and they did not raise their halberds. Dressa walked past them with a small nod. The guards looked at each other. They did not raise the alarm. One of them, a sergeant named Holland, had been waiting 12 years for someone, anyone, to give him a reason to refuse the Cardinal an order. He took the small nod from Dressa Lore as that reason. He walked away from his post. The other guard, after a moment's hesitation, walked away from his. Lyra and her 5 companions walked the length of the cathedral nave in silence. Varen walked beside her, no longer a shadow but a tall, dark figure visible to anyone who could see, with gold eyes that did not blink. The few worshippers in the pews looked up. They did not scream, they did not flee, they stared. Several of them, older worshippers, who had been alive 45 years ago, understood, before anyone said a word, what they were looking at. The Whisperline royal line was walking through the cathedral of Brennhall. The thing the Temple of Pure Light had spent 300 years insisting did not exist was, at this moment, 12 paces from the Cardinal's council chamber. Lyra reached the council chamber door. She did not knock. She opened it. Inside, at a long oak table, sat 7 men. 6 of them were senior priests and royal advisors. The 7th, at the head of the table, was a thin, gray-haired man in red robes. He was 62 years old. He had a long, narrow face. He was, at the moment the door opened, mid-sentence, dictating a 3rd proclamation to a scribe. He stopped speaking. He looked up. He saw a young woman in dark royal attire, a tall, dark figure with gold eyes standing beside her, and 4 others he did not immediately recognize. He recognized the figure with the gold eyes. He had read about it in the founding charter, in a passage so old that only 3 living people had ever seen it. He had hoped, his entire life, that he would die without seeing it himself. He said, "Varen." Varen did not answer. Varen never answered anyone except Lyra. Lyra walked to the center of the chamber. She did not sit. She said, "Cardinal Othric Vane, I am Lyra of the Veiled Hour, Queen of the Whisperline Court, daughter of Sarah, granddaughter of Milas, great-granddaughter of the queen you ordered murdered when you were 23 years old. I have come to inform you that the proclamation you signed with the king's seal 6 weeks ago will be withdrawn today. The 11,000 men you have raised will be sent home. You will write a letter of confession to the king in your own hand, naming yourself as the author of 45 years of fraud against the crown. You will sign it, you will seal it. You will deliver it to the king personally on your knees this evening." The Hollow Cardinal sat very still. The other 6 men at the table did not move. The scribe's quill had stopped halfway through a word. The Cardinal said, "And if I refuse?" Lyra said, "Then Varen will show you what you ordered done to my great-grandmother, in detail, in the small private theater of your own mind. You will not die, you will live, but you will not be able to lie again. Every word you speak for the rest of your life will be the truth. You will not be able to draft another proclamation. You will not be able to sign another order. You will be unable to do anything except answer questions honestly. The king's investigators will ask you questions for the next 20 years. You will tell them everything, every name, every date, every body. You will outlive your usefulness to the temple within a week, and they will try to have you killed, and Varen will not let them, because I will need you alive to keep answering questions until you die naturally of old age." She paused. She said, "Choose." The Hollow Cardinal looked at Varen. He looked at the gold eyes that did not blink. He understood with the absolute clarity that comes to a man who has spent 40 years lying and finds himself finally in a room where lying is not possible, that the young woman in front of him was not making a threat. She was reading him an outcome that had already been decided. He picked up his quill. He pulled a fresh sheet of parchment toward himself. He began to write. He wrote for 2 hours. The other 6 men at the table did not move. The scribe did not move. Lyra stood at the center of the chamber. Mira stood beside her. Brother Canis stood near the door. Calith and Dressa stood at the 2 corners of the room. Varen stood beside the cardinal's chair, and Varen did not blink. When the cardinal was finished, he had filled 14 pages. He had named every priest who had presided over a final purification in the last 45 years. He had named every advisor in the royal court who had been paid by the temple to suppress information. He had named the sums. He had named the dates. He had named the bodies. He had named, in the final paragraph, the man who had taught him as a young priest that the Whisperline Court could be exterminated through patience and quiet murder, a man who had been dead for 30 years and whose grave was in the high cemetery of the Western Temple, and which Lyra would have exhumed and burned 6 months later in a small private ceremony attended by no one except Mira and Varen. The cardinal signed the document. He sealed it. He stood up. He walked on his own legs out of the cathedral, escorted by Dressa Lore and Brother Canis. He delivered the document to the king that evening. He knelt to do it. The king read it. The king did not speak for the rest of the night. In the morning, the king ordered the crusade dissolved. He ordered the temple's senior priesthood arrested. He ordered the Hollow Cardinal placed under permanent house arrest in a small stone chamber in the royal palace, where he would live for another 11 years, answering questions every day until his heart failed in the middle of a sentence about a girl named Threnna, who had died in the ritual chamber of the Temple of Pure Light at the age of 16. Lyra and her companions walked out of the Cathedral of Brennel at midday. The worshippers in the pews stood as she passed. None of them spoke. None of them needed to. But there was a price. The Whisperline Court was now a known sovereign power. The King of Aldenmere opened formal negotiations within a month. Trade agreements were drafted, borders were acknowledged, embassies were established. The thing the Temple of Pure Light had spent 300 years trying to prevent, the legitimate political existence of the Whisperline Court, became, within 2 years of Lyra's coronation, a fact so ordinary that children born in the human kingdoms after that point would grow up unable to understand why their grandparents had been afraid of the South. But the consecrated ground of every Pure Light temple was, by its founding charter, bound against the Whisperline bloodline in a way that even the cardinal's confession could not undo. Lyra could not walk into any of them, not even the empty ones, not even the ruins. The moment her foot crossed the threshold of consecrated stone, the binding sigils in the floor would activate, and she would feel, not pain exactly, but a deep, bone-level refusal, as though the stone itself were rejecting her existence. She tried it once, in the 2nd year of her reign, at a small, disused temple in the eastern marches. She lasted 4 seconds before Varen pulled her back across the threshold. She did not try again. It was a small price. There were 163 Pure Light temples in the kingdom. She would never enter any of them. She would govern the Whisperline Court for 41 years. She would never set foot in a consecrated building. Mira Halloway, who was not of the bloodline, could enter them freely. Mira began, in the 3rd year of Lyra's reign, to make a quiet personal pilgrimage. She visited every Pure Light temple in the kingdom. She went alone. She did not announce herself. She walked into each temple and she stood in the chapel and she said, aloud, the names of the girls who had died there. Father Aldemar Craythorne's catalog gave her the names. There were 341 of them. Mira said every name in every temple. It took her 4 years. When she was done, she came home to the Whisperline Court, and she did not speak about what she had done, and Lyra did not ask. Because Lyra understood that the pilgrimage had not 15 years of her reign. Nessa was crowned at the age of 26. She wore no circlet. She wore instead a small piece of yellow soap on a chain around her neck, which she would wear for the rest of her life, and which her successors would also wear, for reasons that they all understood and that they never explained to outsiders. And the Temple of Pure Light? It survived. Institutions of that age do not die. They reform, they rebrand, they issue apologies, they commission histories. Within a decade of the Cardinal's confession, the temple had reorganized itself into a charitable order that worked with orphans and the poor. Some of the priests who had presided over final purifications were tried and imprisoned. Others were quietly retired. Magister Pel Tarrowwind died in a prison cell at the age of 74, refusing to the last to admit that he had done anything wrong. The Temple of Brenhall was converted into a hospital. The chalk cliff temple where Lyra had been raised was abandoned. Its stones were quarried for new construction. The obsidian floor of the ritual chamber was broken up and dumped into the sea on Lyra's personal order 2 months after her coronation. The pieces of it that remained in the chamber were collected, ground into powder, and used as ink for Father Aldemar Craythorne's Catalogue of the Dead. And the crusade? It never came. The 11,000 men the Hollow Cardinal had raised were dispersed within a month of his confession. Most of them went home to their farms and their wives. A few of them, the ones who had been most zealously committed to the idea of a holy war against the South, formed splinter cells that operated for the next several decades, ambushing Whisperline traders on the eastern roads and burning the occasional border village. They were a nuisance. They were not an existential threat. Lyra's court hunted them down, slowly and patiently, over the course of her reign. By the time she died, the last of them were old men in mountain hideouts, and they were left there because Lyra had made a decision early in her reign that she would not become the thing she had defeated. She would not pursue the last frightened men into their last frightened holes. She would let them die of old age. This was, perhaps, the most controversial decision of her reign. Several of her council disagreed. Tarn Velgrave, in particular, argued for total eradication. Lyra listened. Lyra refused. Lyra said in a sentence that was recorded by Vesha Merriwind and that would be quoted 300 years later in the founding charter of the elective monarchy, "I will not be the mirror of the temple. I will not finish a war by becoming the thing that started it. The men in the mountains can die in the mountains. The Whisperline Court will not be built on their bones." Tarn Velgrave never fully agreed with her. He served her faithfully anyway, for the rest of his life. Dear viewer, I want to leave you with one image, not the image of Lyra on her throne, not the image of the cardinal on his knees in the king's chamber, not the image of the shattered ritual chamber or the burning founding charter or the elective monarchy that outlived its founder by 300 years. I want to leave you with the image of a 9-year-old girl in a washroom at dawn, scrubbing her own skin raw with a piece of yellow soap, because she has been told for 6 years that her skin is the evidence of her sin. And a 12-year-old kitchen girl walking into that washroom, taking the soap out of her hand, and kneeling down beside her with a clean, wet cloth. Everything in Lyra's story, the bloodline, the shadow, the crown, the kingdom, the cardinal's confession, the constitution that outlived them all, everything else is the consequence of that one moment. Without Mira Halloway in the washroom, Lyra would have died in the ritual chamber at the age of 18, and the Whisperline Court would have ended quietly in a sea cave south of Aldenmere, and no one would have ever known. The world turns on small kindnesses. The temple was destroyed by a piece of yellow soap. Remember that. And remember this, too. The Hollow Cardinal's confession named 341 girls, but the records of the Temple of Pure Light go back 300 years, and the temple at Brenhall was only one of 4 major temples, and Father Aldemar Craythorne's catalogue covered only the temples he had personal access to. There are other catalogues, there are other temples, there are other names. In our next episode, I am going to tell you about the temple in the Western Mountains, the one where Brother Canis Oro was raised, and what was found beneath its altar when Lyra's investigators opened the floor in the year of her coronation. I am going to tell you about the abbess who ran that temple for 40 years. I'm going to tell you what she did to the boys. Yes, the boys. The Temple of Pure Light did not only take girls, and the crusade that never came against the Whisperline Court? It was not the only crusade the Hollow Cardinal had been planning. There was a second one, a quieter one, aimed not south but west, against the people who had begun, in the last decade of the Cardinal's career, to ask questions about the disappearances at the Western Temple. The crusade against the Whisperline Court was stopped on the day the Cardinal knelt before the king. The other crusade had already begun. Subscribe to Rise Arc. The kneeling has ended. The reckoning is just starting.